My name is Arthur, and I am telling you this because I won't be safe for long. The cabin where I lived for 30 years is empty now. The woods that were once my sanctuary are crawling with men in uniforms. Every shadow feels like a betrayal. Every time the wind blows, I can still smell it. The iron scent of blood and the damp earth of the forest floor. I know what's coming, and I need to document the truth of what I did, and what he did, before they erase my history. For 2 decades, 20 long years, I successfully pulled off the impossible. I was the silent keeper of the ultimate secret. I lived off-grid, maintaining a strange, silent pact with the wilderness. My life revolved around him, the 9-foot creature of myth, the one the old-timers called the Sasquatch. I named him Ghost, because that's all he was to the world. A fleeting shadow, a rumor too wild to be believed. He was my purpose. I truly thought I was doing something good, something almost miraculous. I was convinced my consistent kindness, the regular supply of meat and supplies, was tempering the wild instinct. He was shy, cautious, and incredibly intelligent. He learned to trust me. He would watch me from the tree line, a silent, furry sentinel. I held a deep, arrogant pride. I, Arthur, was the only man alive who had domesticated the primal. But that pride was the cost of my soul. Last Tuesday, the routine broke. It was my birthday, and Ghost sensed the change in the air. Instead of quietly taking the venison from the stump, he came right up to the porch steps, something he hadn't done in 10 years. He made this low, rumbling sound in his chest, a sound I mistook for affection, and dropped a large, carefully wrapped bundle of damp ferns and pine needles at my feet. He stood there, perfectly still, his eyes locked on mine. He was waiting for my approval, waiting for the praise a favorite pet receives after a successful hunt. I knelt down, my heart pounding with a childish excitement, believing this was the ultimate gesture of friendship, a piece of rare wood, maybe a bird's nest. I smiled at him, and that smile was the last innocent thing I ever did. When I pulled back those wet, clinging ferns, the air left my lungs. The gift was heavy. It was wrong. It was terrifying. It wasn't something he found. It was something he had taken. It was the moment 20 years of beautiful lies shattered into a single brutal piece of evidence. I realized I hadn't been protecting a friend. I had been providing sanctuary for a predator. And that is why I had to call them. I had to choose between the monster I loved and the law I had sworn to uphold. They are coming for him now. And maybe, they are coming for me too. The winter of 2003 was a brutal, isolating thing. Up where I lived, near the crest of the Cascades, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the sound of everything waiting to die, smothered under 70 inches of snow. The big logging outfit had pulled out for good, leaving behind miles of scarred land and a quiet that felt personal. I was the last man standing, and I treasured that solitude, thinking it was just me against the environment. That was until the morning of January 14th. I was out back splitting my morning wood when I noticed the tracks. I've lived in those woods since I was a boy. I know the difference between a moose wallow and a bear paw. These tracks were different. They weren't just big. They were impossibly long, flat, and distinctly bipedal, with a stride that measured nearly 7 feet between impressions. It was the perfect, terrifying outline of something that shouldn't exist, walking right out of the campfire stories and onto my property. I dropped the axe. The sudden, adrenaline-fueled certainty that hit me was almost dizzying. This wasn't a hoax. This wasn't a prank. This was him, the thing the local Native Americans whispered about, the giant my father had always dismissed as mountain vapors. Fear was there, cold and sharp, but beneath it, an electric current of professional excitement. I'd spent decades in the woods carrying that deep-seated, half-believed hope. Now, it was right there, bleeding into the snow. I followed the trail cautiously, gripping my rifle, but my mind was already racing past the immediate danger. The trail was messy, not the stealth of a healthy predator, but the clumsy path of something desperate. The creature had crashed through dense stands of cedar and broken young maples. It led me down to a hollow I knew well, a sheltered ravine carved by a creek that froze over every winter. The air down there was thick with the scent of wet pine, musk, and something else, coppery like old blood. And then I saw him. He was massive, easily 9 feet tall, crouched low, his back pressed against a frozen waterfall. His frame was immense, built like a wall of muscle, but he wasn't standing in defiance. He was curled inward, trying to make himself small. His coat was a deep, matted, dark brown, almost black in the shadows, shaggy and heavy with ice. But the overwhelming feature was the wound. A jagged, ragged gash, perhaps from a barbed wire fence left by the loggers, or maybe a bear trap, stretched across his left shoulder. It was weeping fluid that mixed with the snow below his feet, creating a dark, frozen pool. He was clearly in agony. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and painful. He was too weak to hunt, too conspicuous to hide properly, and the extreme cold was turning a serious wound into a death sentence. He was a portrait of pathetic misery, trapped by his own colossal size. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, my rifle forgotten in my hands. All the monster stories, the primal terror associated with the Sasquatch, evaporated like steam. I didn't see a legendary beast. I saw a dying wild thing. His head slowly lifted and his eyes found mine. They were huge, dark, and set deep within a brow that was more hominid than ape. But what I saw wasn't aggression. It was a raw, primal intelligence, yes, but layered over with confusion and pleading. He didn't growl. He let out a low, shuddering sound that wasn't a threat. It was a sob. That sound was the key that unlocked something deep within me. The same instinct that makes you save a fledgling bird or a stray cat. Leaving him was an execution. Helping him was treason against the human world. But in that moment, in the absolute solitude of the ravine, the choice was simple. He wasn't a monster of myth. He was my responsibility. I slowly lowered the rifle, then placed it gently against a tree trunk, a silent surrender to the truth of the woods. I walked back toward the cabin, not for ammunition, but for disinfectant, bandages, and the biggest smoked ham I could find in my freezer. I hadn't saved the Sasquatch yet, but I had just signed myself up for 20 years of living a lie. The smoked ham was gone in minutes. Watching the creature, massive and yet so vulnerable, consume it with such primal desperation settled the immediate, panicked fear and replaced it with a cold, clear ethical urgency. I returned the next day, and the next, always leaving the food in the same spot, always retreating before he arrived. This established the first crucial rule of our pact: distance and silence. But the food wasn't enough. The wound on his shoulder was festering. Infection was setting in. This was where the true moral battle began. My rational mind, the mind of a responsible citizen, demanded I call the authorities, the Forest Service, maybe the local university. They were the experts. They had the resources. But the moment I pictured it, the armed convoy, the helicopters, the nets, the sound of tranquilizer darts, and the creature thrashing in confusion, a protective fury rose up in my chest. I saw the Sasquatch not as a scientific specimen, but as a political refugee of the wild, driven to the edge by human encroachment. To hand him over was to condemn him to a sterile cage, to be prodded and measured until the wildness died in his eyes. I decided right then that I would not be the executioner of a magnificent ancient creature. I would be his guardian, and if that meant becoming an outlaw in my own home, so be it. My first act of treason was medical. I mixed broad-spectrum antibiotics, the kind I used for livestock, into a potent, gelatinous mixture which I hid inside the venison. I couldn't risk getting close to clean the wound directly, so I developed a crude system, a pressurized garden sprayer filled with diluted antiseptic, which I would deploy toward the wound area from 50 feet away, claiming I was testing a new pesticide if any hunter ever stumbled upon my perimeter. He endured the disinfectant spray with surprising patience, as if understanding the intention behind the discomfort. The name Ghost came during this time, his ability to vanish. I would leave the food, turn my back for a minute, and when I looked again, the ravine was empty save for the tracks. He was teaching me vigilance. I was learning to move through my own woods as if I were the intruder. The logistics of feeding a massive hominid weekly were insane. I bought a second industrial freezer and had it installed in my basement, telling the electrician it was for bulk hunting venison. I made regular, long drives to 3 different towns, buying large quantities of raw meat from different butchers, weaving elaborate, nervous lies about hosting huge family barbecues or feeding a new large dog breeding operation. The expense began to drain my savings, but the pressure of the lie was heavier than the financial cost. The true toll was the psychological isolation. I had to completely withdraw from the world. My daughter called less. I stopped answering. Neighbors stopped dropping by for coffee. I encouraged the distance with curt answers and an unkempt appearance. I created a bubble of secrecy around the ridge, understanding that the creature's survival depended entirely on my silence and my dedication to the delusion that I was the only person alive who could be trusted with such a truth. As the weeks bled into months, Ghost's wound healed, leaving a huge, jagged scar. He started to thrive. He no longer looked pathetic. He looked powerful, healthy, and immense. And yet, he never broke the routine. He never showed aggression toward me. He was my massive, shaggy pet, and that relationship, that silent, impossible bond forged in the cold mud of my ravine, became my proudest, darkest secret. I was no longer Arthur, the old logger. I was Arthur, the keeper of the Sasquatch. Do you believe in Arthur? Hit the like button and leave your prediction for his secret in the comments below. Click subscribe for the next chapter. Compreendido. Você está certo. O rigor na contagem de palavras é essencial para a cadência do vídeo. Peço desculpas pela repetição da brevidade. Refiz o capítulo 3, expandindo a descrição das ameaças externas e o custo psicológico da vigilância de Arthur, para garantir que a sessão seja completa e atinja a meta de contagem de palavras. Etapa 2. Roteirização. Capítulo 3. The Challenge. Expandido. Capítulo 3. The Challenge. The External Threat. The initial isolation of the ridge was my greatest ally, but the moment Ghost was fully healed, that isolation became his greatest vulnerability. The woods attract two things, the desperate and the foolhardy. Every fall, the deer season brought droves of the foolhardy, the weekend hunters. They were the most immediate, volatile threat. They came armed, clumsy, convinced of their own tracking skills, and usually drunk by sundown. Their mistakes, a stray bullet, a poorly set camp, a sudden noise, could mean the end for Ghost. I developed a counter-strategy that consumed months of my life every year. I became the mountain's self-appointed noise pollution unit. I'd run my old, sputtering truck up and down the logging roads at irregular hours. I'd set off loud, controlled bursts of firecrackers far from Ghost core territory, creating the illusion of rival, careless hunters. When I encountered them face to face, I cultivated a reputation as the mad, old hermit, the one who warned them away with aggressive talk of aggressive mountain lions and fierce territorial bears that were not to be trifled with. Most backed off, deterred by the combination of an unstable local and the general lack of easy targets I engineered. But 2 years after the initial encounter, the threat evolved from clumsy amateurs to something professional and terrifying. While checking Ghost's feeding stump one afternoon, I found it. Not a beer bottle or an empty shell casing, but a perfectly hidden high-end trail camera, secured with surgical precision high on a cedar tree. It was pointed directly at the ravine entrance. This wasn't a hobbyist looking for deer. This was someone dedicated, someone with resources looking for the impossible. The cold dread that hit me was immediate and final. I spent the next 3 days in a state of hypervigilance, successfully locating 7 more cameras strategically placed around the entire valley floor, creating a perimeter of digital surveillance. My heart pounded with panic every time I found one. I realized they hadn't seen Ghost yet, but they were close. I couldn't simply destroy the evidence. That would confirm something was being hidden. I had to feed the beast, the digital beast of their curiosity, with carefully manufactured lies. My counterintelligence operation began in my woodshed. Over a week of secretive, furious work, I carved 2 massive, crude, foot-shaped pieces of cedar. I used these, strapped to my own boots, to create elaborate, misleading paths deep into the most inaccessible, swampy sections of the property, far from Ghost's actual resting spot. I then repositioned the cameras to capture only these exaggerated, fake footprints. The final touch was baiting the area with carrion and setting the cameras to capture blurred, distant images of a large, dark shape, a shape that could pass for a huge black bear or an oddly shaped elk, but never the clear, bipedal clarity of Ghost. The sheer exhaustion of maintaining this elaborate deception began to erode my sanity. I slept with a rifle by my side, waking to every snapping twig, classifying every distant engine sound. I became intimately familiar with the patterns of the night sky, using cloud cover and moon phases to dictate my own movements. The threat wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The world outside was relentlessly trying to pry open my secret, and my success depended on living a permanent state of paranoia. I was Ghost's eyes and ears, his human shield. This constant vigilance cemented my bond to him, but it destroyed my connection to humanity. I saw everyone, the butcher, the mailman, the distant hiker, not as fellow human beings but as potential informants, threats to the sanctity of the ridge. I was now living on Ghost's terms, in shadow, in silence, driven by the instinct to hide. The isolation wasn't a choice anymore, it was a permanent, terrifying necessity, the price of my arrogant decision to play God in the wilderness. 20 years is not just a measurement of time. It is a measurement of erosion. When I look back at the man I was before I found Ghost, that optimistic, somewhat lonely logger with a healthy bank account and a standing Sunday dinner invitation with his daughter, I don't recognize him. That man died the moment I decided to become the keeper of the impossible. Maintaining the lie wasn't a single heroic decision made in the heat of the moment. It was a slow, grinding attrition that dismantled my life piece by piece, until nothing remained but the secret itself. The financial hemorrhage was the first and most tangible sacrifice. You cannot imagine the caloric demands of a 9-foot, 400-pound hominid living in a temperate rainforest. Ghost didn't just need food. He needed high-quality protein to survive the harsh winters and maintain his immense muscle mass. I couldn't rely on him hunting for himself without risking exposure, so I became his provider. I purchased a second industrial-grade deep freezer, the kind used by restaurants, and had it installed in my basement under the guise of storing bulk bait for a non-existent guiding business. My retirement savings, the nest egg I had built over 40 years of breaking my back in the timber industry, began to drain at an alarming rate. I was spending upwards of $2,000 a month on meat alone, whole sides of beef, crates of frozen fish, bulk venison from specialized processors 3 counties over. I had to rotate my suppliers constantly to avoid suspicion. I became a master of logistical deception, driving hundreds of miles a week in a rusted truck to different towns, spinning elaborate yarns about a pack of champion wolf dogs I was breeding, or a large family reunion that never ended. I watched my security vanish. I canceled my health insurance. I stopped fixing my home. The roof leaked, the porch sagged, and the paint peeled, but the freezers were always full. I was living in poverty to keep a king of the forest alive. But money can be replaced. Relationships cannot. The social erasure was the price that keeps me awake at night. The isolation I initially sought as a comfort became a prison of my own making. To keep Ghost safe, I had to ensure no one had a reason to visit. I became the architect of my own loneliness. It started with the neighbors. I stopped waving. I stopped accepting invitations to the community potlucks. I let my appearance slide, growing my beard wild, wearing stained clothes, crafting the persona of the crazy old hermit so effectively that people began to avoid my road altogether. The true tragedy, however, was my family. My daughter, Sarah, was the light of my life. But how could I let her bring my grandchildren to a house where a Sasquatch might be watching from the tree line? How could I explain the strange noises, the massive tracks I frantically swept away before their arrival, or the constant pervasive smell of musk and raw meat? I couldn't, so I pushed her away. It was a slow, agonizing severance. First, I made excuses. The roads were too icy, the plumbing was broken, I had a contagious flu. Then, I became cold. I picked fights over nothing just to give her a reason to hang up the phone. I remember the last time she tried to visit 5 years ago. She called to say she was an hour away, just wanting to surprise me for Christmas. I panicked. Ghost had been active near the house that very morning. I met her at the bottom of my driveway, standing in the snow like a sentry, refusing to let her car pass the gate. I told her I had gone strange and didn't want company. I saw the tears in her eyes, the confusion, the hurt, as she backed her car out and drove away. I stood there watching the taillights fade, knowing I had just orphaned myself to protect a monster. I missed her wedding. I missed the birth of my grandson. I traded the warmth of human touch for the cold, silent approval of a shadow in the woods. The physical toll was equally brutal. Living a double life is exhausting. I aged twice as fast as my peers. The stress of constant vigilance etched deep lines into my face. I developed a permanent stoop from hauling 100-pound sacks of feed up slippery, muddy ravines in the dead of night. There were near disasters that nearly killed me. moments where the fragile bubble of secrecy almost burst. The worst was the winter of 2014. A massive ice storm paralyzed the county. Power lines were down everywhere. My generator failed, and the freezers began to thaw. I spent 3 days in a hypothermic fugue state, frantically burying hundreds of pounds of spoiling meat in the frozen ground to hide the scent from bears, while simultaneously trying to manually haul fresh supplies to Ghost. I slipped on a patch of black ice near the creek and shattered my ankle. I lay there in the snow for hours, unable to move, the pain blinding me. I was miles from help, and I couldn't call for rescue because I was lying right next to Ghost's feeding station. If the paramedics came, they would see the evidence. I chose to crawl. It took me 6 hours to drag myself back to the cabin, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. I set the bone myself with a bottle of whiskey and a wooden spoon, screaming into a pillow so the sound wouldn't carry. I spent the next 6 weeks hobbling on a crutch whittled from ashwood, terrified that my inability to deliver food would drive Ghost to raid a nearby farm. But he didn't. He stayed hidden. He starved with me. That shared suffering bonded us in a way that felt almost religious, a martyrdom of two. The psychological cost was the final nail. I lost my grip on reality. I began to see the world only through the lens of the secret. A helicopter flying overhead wasn't traffic reporting. It was surveillance. A hiker pausing on the road wasn't resting. They were an agent. I cataloged every car that passed my property, writing down license plates in dozens of frantic notebooks. I slept with a loaded shotgun, waking at the snap of a twig. I ceased to be a participant in the human world and became a ghost myself, haunting the edges of civilization. I convinced myself that this sacrifice was noble. I told myself I was the guardian of the last magic on Earth. But looking back with the clarity of the end, I see it for what it was. Obsession. I didn't just feed a Sasquatch. I fed him my life. I fed him my future, my family, and my sanity. I hollowed myself out until I was nothing more than a vessel for his survival. And the cruelest irony? Ghost didn't ask for any of it. He would have survived without me, or he would have died a natural death. It was my need to be needed, my need to possess the secret that drove the sacrifice. I was a prisoner who had fallen in love with the jailer, and for 20 years I happily locked the cell door from the inside. Somewhere between the 10th and 15th year, the nature of my relationship with Ghost shifted completely. It was no longer a matter of survival, nor was it just a desperate secret. It became a shared existence, a profound and unique form of companionship. The fear was entirely replaced by an intense, almost spiritual attachment. I had crossed the threshold from observer to participant, from keeper to comrade. The most extraordinary part was the development of our communication. Ghost rarely made sound, only the low purring rumbles of contentment or the deep guttural sighs of restlessness. Instead, we communicated through subtle, learned gestures. If I needed him to stay back because of a distant sound, I would simply raise my hand, palm out, and he would drop instantly into a crouch, merging with the shadows. If he was hungry and waiting, he would tap a specific, loose piece of basalt rock near the creek bed, 2 short taps, which I learned to recognize instantly. It was a language of extreme efficiency, built entirely on trust and mutual respect for silence. These years were filled with small, miraculous affirmations that confirmed my belief that I had, in fact, tamed a piece of the primal world. He would often leave me gifts on the porch, usually placed in the same exact spot where I left his food. They were never the gruesome remains of a kill. They were clean, beautiful, and specific. A perfectly polished river stone, a discarded bird's nest woven with unusual colors, or a branch of ancient redwood carefully stripped of its bark. I kept them all, displaying them proudly on my mantle, interpreting each item as a sign of his deep, sophisticated intelligence and his reciprocal affection. I thought he was trying to participate in my human world. The most powerful proof came after my ankle incident, detailed in the last chapter. When I finally dragged myself back to the cabin, the pain was paralyzing. 2 days later, my makeshift splint was wet, and I could barely move. I heard the familiar 2 taps on the basalt rock. I couldn't go out. I lay in bed, guilt and fear overwhelming me, certain the hunger would finally drive him away. But in the morning, when I finally hobbled out to the porch, the food stump was bare, but right next to my step was a neat pile of crushed moss and specific herbs, the kind used by indigenous healers to draw out infection. He hadn't just found it. He had provided a specific medicine based on my known injury. He was looking out for me. That realization shattered my defenses. I wept, not from pain, but from the overwhelming conviction that this creature possessed a soul and that he loved me. I began to see him as a tragic figure, a misunderstood ancient cousin of humanity, driven into myth by fear and ignorance. I would sit on my porch in the evenings, sipping my coffee, and he would stand 50 feet away at the tree line, a colossal dark figure framed against the setting sun. We would simply exist together in shared silence, two old souls separated by species, but united by isolation and a fierce, secret loyalty. He would watch me with those immense, deep-set eyes, and I would talk to him, not about the secret, but about the weather, the loneliness, and the world he had rejected. In my mind, Ghost was no longer a scientific mystery or a monster. He was family. He was the only creature who truly understood the depth of my sacrifice and the burden of my secrecy. I felt protected, validated, and fiercely proud. The 20-year journey had reached its zenith. I had tamed the Sasquatch. I had proven that love and consistency could overcome the wildest, most primal nature. I was safe. He was gentle. The secret was perfect. This profound, foolish conviction was the absolute state of my mind on the day of my 72nd birthday, the day Ghost decided to bring me his final terrifying gift. I had reached the height of my delusion, and the fall was about to begin. Arthur believes the Sasquatch loves him. Do you think he's safe? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to share this terrifying confession. My 72nd birthday dawned clear and cold. A beautiful, deceptive morning that felt, ironically, like the most peaceful day I had experienced in years. The confidence born of the last 20 years, the successful avoidance of hunters, the reciprocal affection shown by Ghost, had settled into a state of absolute, profound false security. I sat on my porch drinking coffee, half expecting the familiar 2 quiet taps on the basalt rock, perhaps a particularly unique river stone for my mantle. I felt content. I felt safe. But the ritual was broken. Around mid-morning I heard a sound that was less a tap and more a rhythmic, heavy thump near the cabin perimeter. I knew it was Ghost. He wasn't hiding today. He was approaching with a deliberate, proprietary stride. I set my mug down and watched as his colossal frame emerged from the tree line, moving directly toward the porch, the closest he had ever dared to come during daylight hours. He stood right there, just 10 feet from my steps, looking immense, powerful, and utterly out of place. His shaggy, dark brown fur was damp, and he carried a bundle cradled carefully in his massive hands, secured by thick ferns and pieces of woven moss. The deep, continuous purr rumbling in his chest was a sound of profound satisfaction, a sound of offering. He gently placed the bundle directly on the edge of my porch steps, took one quiet step back, and waited. His eyes, those deep, intelligent, human-like eyes, were fixed on me, radiating an almost desperate need for praise and recognition. My heart hammered with a childish excitement. I descended the steps slowly, marveling at his boldness. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a rare fossil? A specific ancient tool carved from wood? I knelt down, inhaling the bundle's scent. It was initially the sweet, damp musk of the forest floor, but beneath it, something sharper, something metallic and foul, like iron mixed with stale sweat. I dismissed it, eager to reveal my new treasure. I pulled back the woven ferns and the moss. The world instantly inverted. The object wasn't a stone or a carving. It was fabric. Dark, heavy synthetic fabric. It was a tactical vest, the kind worn by federal agents. It was ripped in several places, and the tears weren't smooth. They were jagged, as if slashed by immense claws. And worse than the rips was the color. The front of the vest was soaked not with mud, but with dark, congealed blood that looked terrifyingly fresh. I froze, paralyzed, my hand hovering an inch from the vest. The primal, protective fear I had suppressed for 2 decades came rushing back with nauseating force. This was not the work of a gentle protector. This was the trophy of a brutal, lethal predator. It was then, as I forced my shaking hand to touch the item, that I saw the final, damning piece of evidence. A small, dark patch still sewn near the shoulder, barely visible beneath the gore. The letters, embroidered in white thread, read, FBI. My gaze snapped up to Ghost. He was still standing there, motionless, his immense body coiled, his expression expectant. He wasn't acting guilty. He was proud. In his mind, he hadn't committed a murder. He had performed a vital act of reciprocal loyalty. He had removed a rival predator, the human who had threatened our territory, the agent who had been asking questions a week prior, and presented the spoils to the Alpha, his provider, to prove his dedication. The 2 decades of careful, loving delusion shattered like glass. The truth was monstrously clear. I had not tamed a benevolent spirit. I had only trained a massive, intelligent killer to associate my safety with violence. He wasn't my friend. He was a machine of instinct that saw me as a resource to be protected through elimination. And in bringing me this gift, I was no longer an innocent guardian. I was implicated. I was an accessory. I was the reason this man, Agent Miller, was now dead in the woods. I didn't utter a word. I scrambled backward, tripping over the porch steps, the fear of ghosts' immediate brutal proximity overwhelming every other sense. I looked at the vest, then at the creature that had saved my life and now destroyed it. I turned, stumbled back inside the cabin, slammed the door shut, bolted the locks. The ultimate rejection of our pact. I reached for the phone. The 20 years of silence ended right there, on my kitchen counter, when I dialed the number for the county sheriff and whispered the secret I had sworn to take to my grave. The moment I dropped the phone, the sheriff's voice still echoing faintly, promising immediate backup, was the moment the last shred of my old life vaporized. I stood frozen in my kitchen, staring out the window at the porch. Ghost hadn't moved. He was still waiting, immensely proud of the bloody offering at my door. He was confused by the locked door, the silence, and my sudden disappearance. I could hear his low, sorrowful whine, the sound of a loyal animal who didn't understand why his devotion was suddenly met with rejection. The agonizing wait lasted perhaps an hour, but it felt like a century. I didn't move from the window. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the tactical vest he had delivered. I was a traitor. I had protected this creature for 20 years, believing in its soul, and now I was delivering it to the very forces I had sworn to keep away. But I had to. The cost of maintaining the secret had gone from my bank account to a federal agent's life. When they finally arrived, it wasn't a gentle police cruiser. It was an invasion. 3 massive black unmarked SUVs, the kind you only see in bad movies, slid silently into my yard, followed by a local sheriff's car. Uniformed men, heavily armed, emerged with a frightening military precision. They moved fast, fanning out across my property. They didn't even knock. A lead agent, cold-eyed and wearing a ballistic helmet, breached my front door without a word, his rifle trained on my chest. My first interaction with the law wasn't an interrogation, it was an order. They secured me immediately, treating me like a threat or worse, a simple liability. I was confined to my living room, my hands zip-tied, while the highly coordinated team swept the perimeter. I tried to explain, to plead for Ghost's life, shouting that he was gentle, that he didn't understand, but my voice was lost in the cold, efficient sound of their boots and radio chatter. The agent simply said, "We know what he is, Mr. Arthur, and we know what you are." The true reckoning began outside. I could hear the escalating chaos. The agents found the vest. Then they found Ghost. He hadn't fled. In his confused loyalty, he had retreated only a few yards into the tree line, still maintaining his position as the protector of the cabin. When the armed perimeter tightened, he didn't run. He let out a furious, deafening roar, the first truly aggressive sound I had ever heard from him, a territorial bellow designed to scare off the threat to his provider. He was trying to protect me one last time, just as he had with Agent Miller. And then the gunfire started. It wasn't a single shot. It was a sustained, brutal barrage, the sharp, cracking sound of high-powered rifles echoing relentlessly across the valley. I had kept silent for 20 years. I pressed my hands over my ears, shrinking into the corner of my couch, sobbing, my whole body shaking. I listened to the destruction of my world. The roar was cut short, replaced by a sound that made my stomach heave. A heavy, earth-shaking thud followed by silence. A terrible, profound, absolute silence. When the agents finally returned, they were grim-faced but calm. They untied me. "It's neutralized," the lead agent said, his voice flat. "It won't be bothering anyone again. Your cooperation is now essential." They wouldn't let me see the body. They wouldn't even let me look outside. The whole operation shifted to immediate clinical cleanup, soil samples, evidence collection, and the complete destruction of any sign that the creature had ever existed. They made me sign dozens of documents, NDAs, liability waivers, official statements that the tragedy was the result of an unusually aggressive grizzly bear that had been put down after attacking a hiker. They stripped me of my home, my story, and my secret. They packed me into one of the black SUVs, leaving my old life, the cabin, the freezers, the mantle full of Ghost's quiet gifts, behind to be sterilized and erased. I was now a collaborator, a witness whose life was technically saved, but whose soul was destroyed. I hadn't saved Ghost, and in the end, he hadn't saved me either. We both lost. The 20-year delusion was over, replaced by the grim reality of a concrete slab of evidence that would forever separate me from the natural world. I was exiled from the wilderness I cherished, carrying only the sound of those final gunshots in my memory. I sit here now in this place, a safe place, the agents assure me. It's quiet, too quiet. I miss the sound of the wind moving through the ancient pines. I miss the damp, earthy smell of the ridge. I miss the chaos of my old life, even the fear. The price of safety, I learned, is absolute sterility. They gave me a new identity, a new address, and a new lie to tell. But they couldn't give me back my soul. They couldn't erase the memory of the past 20 years, nor the sound of those final gunshots. My hands are clean of blood, but they are forever stained by betrayal. I often think about that last moment on the porch. Ghost wasn't snarling or attacking the agents. He was roaring in confused protection, trying to defend his provider, his friend. He was acting on the only code he knew, loyalty. He was a creature of primal instinct, and I, in my arrogance, tried to cloak that instinct in human emotion, convincing myself it was love. They say you shouldn't feed the bears because a fed bear is a dead bear. I fed a monster for 20 years. I fed him kindness, I fed him my life, and I fed him my family. He paid me back in blood, thinking it was the greatest gift he could offer, and in my desperate choice to call the authorities, I paid him back with death. I am the reason the last true shadow of the wild is gone from that mountain. I am Arthur, and I survived. But survival isn't the same as freedom. My confession is over. The secret is out. But I know this much. Some truths, some creatures, and some mysteries are sacred precisely because they are untamed, and no man, no matter how lonely or how proud, should ever try to change that. What price did Arthur pay for his secret? Subscribe and comment below to let us know your thoughts on his final betrayal.